And so I'm going to sort of pursue the optimistic story, but I'm going to stress that I'm only conditionally optimistic, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. I spend a lot of my time criticizing my own colleagues in the economics fraternity for applying the wrong kind of models for structural change. The application of a model based on fixed parameters and a unique equilibrium just doesn't make sense in an environment where you have these reinforcing mechanisms, rapid tipping points where you can flip from one network to another. We've seen that in renewables. We've seen that in electric vehicles. We are going to see that in sectors like steel, cement, these kind of deviously difficult, intrinsically complex sectors to decarbonize. Why won't we have a zero-carbon 787 by 2050? I don't know. I can't tell you how that will happen. But if I stood up before you 10 years ago and said that, the price of solar PV or lithium-ion batteries would fall by 90% over a decade, you would have rightly laughed at me. And all energy experts, I think I'm right in saying all energy experts and all economists got this wrong. And I usually point to the IEA, not to lampoon them, but to make a point that even the most kind of informed and knowledgeable body on the planet, year after year, literally every single year it puts out its World Energy Outlook, it gets its forecast wrong in terms of the deployment of renewables, it underestimates them. And it gets its forecast of the cost of renewables wrong year after year after year, again in the same direction, it overestimates them. And the two aren't independent, they are strongly correlated. Of course, one of the ways you push the price down of these new technologies is through learning by doing, through scaling up, through network complementarities and so on. And as the price comes down, it increases the incentive to deploy them. As you deploy more, then the price comes down. And so you get this rapid flip from one network to another, which whether you give two hoots about the climate, you're going to get cheaper electricity, you're going to get cheaper, better performing electric vehicles. It'll move to haulage, it'll move to other sectors as well. So at this point, people say, wow, you're very optimistic. You think we can just have this licked in a nutshell. Well, that would be to mischaracterize what I'm actually saying. And here I invoke one of my favorite economists, Paul Romer, won the Nobel Prize in, I believe it was 2018. And he distinguishes complacent optimism from conditional optimism. Did anybody know? Is anyone aware of this distinction that he made? I think it's a great one. And he uses the imagery of a child that simply waits for presents to arrive, waits for things to happen. And he contrasts that with a child that says, you know what? Why don't we go and build a tree house? We can get some nail and some woods and some kids from the neighborhood. We can have a lot of fun and we can end up with something pretty good. And what this analogy says is that if we want to green the planet, if we want to push technologies in a certain direction, what we cannot do is just sit and wait for it to happen. Innovation tends not to happen in a vacuum. It happens when you want it to. If you don't push it, the path of least resistance is the way we've always done things before, right? There's a lot of inertia in the system. We know we have a knowledge base, we have jobs, we have institutions that are based on a particular kind of production, and that's how we'll keep doing it. Even if it's a duff and unproductive technology, we're not going to shift unless we're given a really strong reason to shift. But when we do shift, we can actually end up with something a lot better. And that's what Romer's saying. He's saying that actually, rather than sort of suggesting that these technologies will fall out of manna from heaven, let's try and build them, let's try and design them, let's try and steer the economy in that direction. And that's kind of neat because it gives policymakers and investors and business people a lot more power, because they can actually make decisions early on that really change the course of the economy. And this is why the economic models don't work, right? Because initial conditions have an amplified, if you like, path-dependent impact on the outcomes in 2030, 2040, 2050. So when somebody says to an economist, what's it going to cost to meet net zero in 2050? The answer is not 1%. It's not 0%. It's not 2%. In fact, the answer is, it depends. It may cost nothing if we take the action early and manage that transition so that we get a lot of the benefits. Bill mentioned a few of them, and I won't go through them. There are many more. And many of them, actually, I was part of something called the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. We said you can actually get between 50 and 90% of a pathway to net zero within 5 years at no cost to GDP because of things like particulate pollution reduction, cost of congestion down, greater efficiency, and so on. Stuff politicians like, by the way, stuff that helped shift the narrative in the Paris Accord from one of burden sharing, we all have to roll our sleeves up and do what we need to do for the good of the planet, Did that work? No. It led to free riding. It led to everybody, the classic tragedy of the commons, everybody waiting for everybody else to act. Once you point out that there are short-term benefits, then that acts as a different attractor, because people can go, and politicians can go back to their people and say, look, we've made a voluntary contribution that is in our self-interest, that is about opportunity rather than burden. And then that profit becomes a little bit self-fulfilling, because the deployment and the investment is implemented, you begin to generate those cost reductions, and you begin to generate those reinforcing feedbacks that can very quickly allow you to transition different sectors and make costs much lower. So the answer, what's it going to cost in 2050, is it depends. It depends on the pathways, it depends on the decisions that we take, and it depends on the choices that we make early on today. And one of the wonderful things about a system that's based not on commodities, as Bill said, digging stuff up, transporting it across the world in pipelines and trains and so on, and burning it, is very labor-intensive, it's very costly. By the way, it's labor-intensive, that means politically it's very sensitive. People still build coal-fired power stations, even though coal is a defunct technology, primarily for political reasons. There are jobs involved. They don't do it for efficiency reasons. The biggest problems here, by the way, are not economic or technological. They are political, they are institutional, they are cultural. That's both an opportunity, it means we can do it, but it's also a serious drawback, because politics matters. Anyone who takes a look at the state of affairs of the planet at the moment will realize that. So that's, in a sense, where we are, and one of the beauties about shifting from the commodity-based system to a technology-based system is that ideas are weightless. They are not subject to diminishing returns. Getting more fossil fuels means that, exploiting reserves in ever more exotic locations at a higher cost. You get increasing returns to scale. Generating energy through technology-based systems like solar PV, like wind, like storage, like hydrogen, like batteries, is a knowledge-based system, which is subject to increasing returns to scale. The more you deploy, the more you get. Yes, we're going to have to dematerialize. Yes, we can't live on a planet, on 3 planets a year. We don't have to go to 0, by the way. We just have to get it down to 1 planet a year. But if I said to you tomorrow, you've got to limit your consumption to 1 planet's worth a year, what would you think would happen? It'd be a horrific crunch on GDP for a while, okay? It wouldn't happen because degrowth never works, because you not only lose the resources for innovation, you lose the political will as well. Anyone who looks at rationing consumption in the kind of Soviet Union or the post-war era in Europe will know that these aren't periods of great environmental enlightenment, quite the reverse. Look at a map of the Dominican Republic next to Haiti and figure out which one is correlated with consumption, which level of consumption is correlated with what level of environmental stewardship. But I digress. The point here is that the knowledge economy, because it's weightless, if you were to limit yourself to the consumption of 1 planet a year, which is what we'd have to do, would, after an initial shock, exactly mean that you would have infinite growth. Because people like to invoke the second law of thermodynamics and say, well, you can't grow exponentially. There have to be physical limits. Now, that's flawed on at least 2 counts. One is actually the Earth is not a closed system if you get your energy from the sun, and there's plenty of that, as we've seen. And wind energy is a form of indirect solar energy as well. That's one. But the other thing is that ideas build on ideas. Because they're subject to increasing returns to scale, exactly what you would get if you constrained your economy to living on 1 planet a year, 1 planet's worth of resources. You're familiar with this metaphor, right? We consume 2 planets every year. Of course, that can't go on. But if we had to limit ourselves to 1, what would happen? Well, we would get cleverer and better at using the resources we'd have. We'd get more productive because ideas build on ideas, provided we don't blow ourselves up, which of course is a big if. We will only ever get to use those resources we have more efficiently. So exponential growth is not only possible, it is exactly what you get if you limited your material consumption. And that's the key point. It's not about growth, it's about the kind of growth. And it's about material growth. And it's a challenge, primarily politically and culturally, to limit our material growth. But the essence here, to go back to the conditional versus complacent optimism story, is that we should stop trying to forecast future trends because we don't know what the answer is, and that answer is conditional, and spend a heck of a lot more time trying to steer and design and build that future. And I speak as an economist who spends far too much time in a profession that spends far too much time doing the former. Thank you very much.